Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. My guest on today's episode is Mark Rank. He is a professor of social welfare at Washington University in St. Louis, and the co-author of the new book, Poorly Understood: What America Gets Wrong About Poverty. As we are seeing in Washington, the president's initiative for a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure plan, continued debate about a minimum wage. This is going to be a big issue, and it's such an important issue. As Mark talks about, the focus of his book and his look at poverty is to bring real science and real facts and real research to these deep-seated myths about poverty. Everything from who is poor, who are people who are poor, where do they live, and why are they poor? There are so many myths about this, and in his book and in our conversation today, we tackle some of those myths and need to understand how do we address these deep, morally disturbing, distressing, and ultimately societally very expensive problems in this country. How do we fix this? How do we have to know how we talk about it. And so we begin that conversation on today's episode of Good Law, Bad Law. Stay tuned. I want to welcome my guest on today's episode, Mark Rank. Mark is a professor of social welfare at Washington University in St. Louis, and is a co-author of the new book, Poorly Understood: What America Gets Wrong About Poverty. And so first of all, Mark, welcome, and thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Oh, thanks, Aaron. It's great to be with you.
We were just chatting before we got started today about what excellent timing this is for this book, and to take on the subject of poverty and add real statistical and other types of research to so many of the big questions and really the myths that people have about poverty, because we're in a legislative moment where there's tremendous focus on issues of income inequality, wealth inequality, and some of the systemic and structural problems we have in this country when it comes to poverty. So I'm really excited to have the chance to have you talk with us about that today. Tell us a little bit about yourself, first of
Yeah.
all, and how you got into this topic, and what the focus of the book is,
Yeah.
different from what's been written over the decades about poverty till now.
Yeah. So I've been, working in this area of poverty and inequality for, a number of years, decades actually. And, my interest sort of in this has been that, the United States is the wealthiest country in the world, and yet we wind up having some of the highest rates of poverty, the highest amounts of income and wealth inequality. And it just seems like a fundamental paradox as to why that is. So I've been doing, work for a long period of time on this question, and we'll talk about some of that work, which is in the book. The book is, I was on the phone with one of my co-authors, and we were talking about some other stuff. And he and I were saying, you know what, there really hasn't been a book that focused on the myths of poverty, of welfare, of inequality, and kind of took those on in each individual chapter, took on a myth. And we thought
Mhm.
that would be a really, really good book to do because, as you know, there's so many myths out there surrounding these topics. And I would argue that's one of the reasons why the United States does have such high rates of poverty is because we've misunderstood this issue from the get-go. And so the book is an attempt to say, let's look at these myths and let's shed some empirical evidence and research and see how those myths hold up. And they don't hold up at all. So that's kind of the idea behind the book.
So this is the Mythbusters approach
Yeah.
to the big question of
Yeah.
poverty.
Yeah, you could look at it that way. Exactly.
Well, it's interesting. My own interest in the subject goes way back in my career too. As I'm just thinking, I had a summer job during college, working for a kind of a very thinky, policy-oriented magazine called the National Journal.
Hmm.
And the story that I worked on over that summer was about the definition of poverty,
Ah.
and how it really is a moving target, and how, as a political matter, all you have to
Yeah.
do
Hmm.
is redefine how we define poverty, and you can
Yeah.
claim credit overnight with wiping millions of people off the poverty rolls, but you haven't actually done anything. You haven't actually changed
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah, in fact, if you remember a couple years ago, ex-President Trump kind of did this thing where he said his commission said, "Well, there is no more poverty in the United States because we've eliminated it."
Okay.
And what they did is they just defined it in a very very narrow way.
Mm, yeah.
So yeah, that it's very much the measuring of poverty is not just some dry academic issue. It's also a really topical political issue as well, because just as you said, if you want to um, tell a story that maximizes the extent of poverty, you'll define it a certain way, and if you want to minimize the extent of poverty, you might define it another way.
Well, and we live now as everybody knows, and we say it all the time, we live in such a politically charged, politically polarized time. And you know, I think that has a lot to do with the perpetuation of these myths,
Yeah.
because people are listening, they're getting their
Yeah.
information from within these news bubbles, and they're highly politicized to where, for instance, if you want to talk about anything from a policy point of view that addresses income equality, according to one side of the political aisle, you're talking about socialism. And as soon as as soon as you label that socialism, that's the end of the conversation. That's, because
Yeah.
people are going to turn off.
Yeah, and we actually, when we get to the end of the book, we talk about the issue of, having shown that all of these myths, just do not hold up. Why then do they continue? And I talk about some sociological reasons, but one of my co-authors is a psychologist, and she talks about some psychological reasons, and it gets at what you're talking about, which
Mm,
is kind of known as confirmatory bias. That is, you only look at things that confirm your worldview, or you only listen to things that confirm your worldview. And that's how stereotypes and misperceptions are formed, is that we only take in what's consistent with our beliefs and we
right.
exclude all the rest.
Well, these are a couple, there's so many pieces of statistical fact that if you really want to understand the depth and scope of poverty, I think really do that. They focus you on exactly what we're talking about in this country. One of them is what the poverty line is. What is the line that
Hmm.
separates somebody from technically being considered
Hmm.
in poverty? And it's $22,000, which which sounds like, there's just no two ways about it. That doesn't in any way provide a living a
Yeah.
wage, a living amount of income to a family.
Yeah,
Um,
and the thing with that is, so that's the poverty line for a family of three.
mm,
But that represents poverty at its most opulent level. So it turns out that 45% of people that are in poverty in the United States fall below half that official poverty line. So instead of trying to survive on $22,000 a year, imagine a family of three trying to survive on $11,000. So as you're pointing out, this is a very, very conservative measure of poverty.
wow. Well, and the other statistic that really jumped out at me, because it speaks to the precariousness of life at this level of income, and that is that, as you point out, in 2019, 37% of Americans didn't have $400
Yeah.
to cover an unanticipated emergency. I mean, one trip to
Yeah.
the emergency room,
Right.
and you're well over $400, particularly if at that income level, you probably don't have health insurance. And so,
Yeah.
that one ER
Yeah.
visit's going to wipe out that $400 and then some.
Yeah, no, that's right. And there's so, I mean, that what that really illustrates is that, there's a huge chunk of the population that are living paycheck to paycheck, that if anything out of the ordinary goes wrong, a car breaks down, or as you said, a medical emergency, that's just going to throw folks into real economic despair. So, and yeah, it's like, the Federal Reserve does this study every year, and the last year for 2019 was 37% of Americans don't have $400 to cover an emergency. I mean, that's a staggering number.
Staggering. It really, and to live that way. So it's the it's the very little that the money you're still working very hard to bring in actually buys for you and your family, but it's also the stress, the anxiety, the worry of that unexpected thing happening and what that would do to you and your family that goes along with this. Okay, so I don't want you to give away the whole book, obviously,
Oh,
but
that's okay.
we want people to buy and read the book. But how? Maybe we could. How did you decide what are these myths? And
Yeah.
we can talk about some.
Yeah.
But how did you? Since we're talking about how things are
Yeah.
defined, how did you decide what is a myth when it comes to
Hmm.
poverty, so that
Yeah.
you could go about debunking that myth?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, what we did is, after this conversation with one of my co-authors, each of us sort of sat down, and we have encountered this, for years in our careers, because we were all focusing on poverty and inequality. So we each wrote down a list of myths, and actually they were very, very consistent. And so we
Mhm.
took that list of myths, which was around, I don't know, 15 or 20, and we then kind of categorized them into different broad categories. So the first section of the book looks at who are the poor and the myths surrounding that. The second section looks at why is there poverty and the
Mhm.
myths around that. So we divide this into kind of 5 broad sections in which there's a chapter that deals with each of the kind of separate myths. So that's kind of how we came up with it. And there certainly are others that are not in here, but I think we cover kind of the major myths that are out there and the major stereotypes around poverty and inequality.
Well, and you also, Mark, did kind of a very condensed version of the work that's in the book for a piece that was
Hmm.
published last month in the Washington Post. Um, and you looked at 5 myths. So obviously not all of what's covered in the book. And I found this one really fascinating, which is the first myth that you addressed in this op-ed or this
Yeah.
article, which is that this myth that poverty happens to other people,
Hmm.
which suggests that even those who are poor, who are technically at or below the poverty level, don't think of themselves as being that. I mean, it must include some number of people who themselves are poor, but they think this is something that relates to other people, but not to them.
Yeah, yeah, this is a huge myth, is that there's the feeling that poverty is an issue of them and not an issue of us. That it
Hmm.
happens to other people, it's not going to happen to me. And what we show kind of from the get-go in this first section is that actually we might think of it as the reach of poverty is really, really wide. So, for example, most Americans at some point during their adulthood will experience a year below the official poverty line. So, 60% of folks will experience poverty below the official poverty line. And 3/4 of Americans will experience either a year of poverty or near poverty. So this is, you're talking about 3/4 of Americans will experience either poverty or just above poverty. That's, most of us. And
Right.
but we think of poverty as, it happens to somebody else. It's in somebody else's neighborhood. Um, and really the way to think about it is that actually poverty is going to affect most of us at some point. And people ask me, they say, well, how can those numbers be so high? How can those statistics be so high? But think about what I've been doing in my work is life course research, and so I'm looking over the course of 30 or 40 years, and during the course of that period of time, things happen to people that they didn't anticipate it. So you lose a job, you get
Yeah.
sick, your family splits up, a pandemic occurs. All of these things have the potential to throw people into poverty, and when these events happen, and we can talk about this later, but there's not a lot to protect people from
Hmm.
falling into poverty. We don't have a strong safety net at all. It's very, very weak. And so when these things happen, like that $400 emergency, there's not a lot to protect people.
Well, it's safety net, and it's also I'm thinking right now of the Biden infrastructure plan, or this jobs plan that he's now starting to talk about. We really haven't had a plan for dealing with structural changes in the economy, which ties into another one
Yeah.
of the statistics that you talk about, which is the nature of jobs in this country, and that 44% of all jobs in the United States today are low-paying jobs with no benefits. So
Right.
again, if you've got a very razor-thin safety net for yourself in terms of savings, and you have a low-paying job, or maybe two jobs that are
Yeah.
low-paying and no benefits, you're really in a vulnerable position compared to a time not that long ago
Hmm.
when the
Hmm.
economy was made up of many, many more good paying jobs that had pensions, that had health plans, that had, all kinds of benefits we take for granted as having gone along with those jobs.
Yeah.
Those are big structural changes in the economy that we haven't really addressed in any coherent or broad way.
Yeah, no, that is exactly right. I mean, that is what has unfortunately happened in the United States is that really um, since about the early 1970s, the economy has been producing more and more low-wage jobs, jobs that, as you point out, don't have benefits. We've been producing more and more part-time jobs. And so, as you said, 45% of all jobs in the United States today are considered low paying. That is less
Mhm.
than $16 an hour. So you can be working at these jobs full time and still find yourself in poverty. And this gets to another kind of myth that I think is really, really important. And that is the myth of why poverty exists in the United States. The way that we've generally thought about it is that it has to do with an individual failing. That
Right.
there's something wrong with you're not working hard enough, or you don't have enough education or skills, or these kinds of things. When it turns out poverty is the result of a structural failing. That is, the economy is not producing enough jobs for everybody who needs those good paying jobs. And so, what we do is we're focusing on who loses out at the game rather than why the game is producing losers in the first place. And that's
Right.
what we really need to focus on.
I remember when I first moved to Philadelphia in 1990. Um, I forget how it came to be, but I attended some event, and then mayor of Philadelphia, Ed Rendell, who went on to become governor of Pennsylvania and other positions. But at the time, he was mayor of Philadelphia, and I've never forgotten this one point that he made in this speech, which was that in the prior 25 years, so this would have been 1965 to 1990 that he's talking about, Philadelphia lost 250,000
Wow.
manufacturing jobs.
Wow.
It's staggering.
That's
And,
staggering. Yeah.
those were, I have to imagine, for the most part, pretty good paying jobs for the time, stable, steady, good work.
Hmm.
and not just for the individual having that job, for their families, for their communities, for the tax base, for the city, in terms of services that need to get paid for. I mean, the impact of that is is wild to imagine. And Philadelphia's never replaced those jobs. They're just gone.
Yeah, and you could go to, I mean, here in St. Louis, you can go to just about any city and see that same story being played out. And yeah, that has been a major, major transformation. And one of the reason why those jobs were so good also is because they were unionized.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of manufacturing jobs, most manufacturing jobs, in fact, were unionized, and that provided strong benefits and protections as well. And we know what's happened with unions over the last 40 years or so. They've been, it's been decimated. So now it used to be, I think, about 35% of people in the private sector were in a unionized job, and today I think it's around 6 or 7%.
Mm.
So it's again, it's a structural change that's happened that has really fallen hard on the backs of individuals and families.
So how do these myths, I mean, obviously the focus of your book is to debunk these myths
Mhm.
with just like we're trying to debunk bleach and hydrochloroquinone with real science. You're trying to debunk these myths with facts,
Yeah.
with research, with empirical data. But how, I mean, in the course of doing that, Mark,
Yeah.
how do you think these myths be not only come about in the first place, but become so entrenched in
Mhm.
people thinking, in the way our legislators debate these issues? Do you have any sense
Yeah. Yeah.
of why we're in this place where people have such deep misunderstanding about poverty and its causes?
Yeah, yeah, those are great questions. So I think if we think about why did these myths come about, one of the reasons I think, and I've done other work on kind of around the American dream and around individualism, is that America has always been steeped in the idea of rugged individualism. That
Mm.
you kind of do it on your own. You don't depend on others. You're self-reliant,
Right.
and this is kind of viewed or colored our view of a whole bunch of issues. And so this is the land of opportunity. Therefore,
Mhm.
if you're not doing well, there must be something wrong with you.
Right.
You're not working hard enough. And
Mm.
so this is kind of entrenched in our overall ideology. But the question of, well, why do these myths continue despite all this evidence against them? And one, as I said in the beginning, my psychologist colleague talks about some psychological reasons, but I talk about a few sociological reasons, and that is, who is benefiting from these myths? Who benefits from the perpetuation of these myths? Well, first of all, we can clearly point to politicians and political actors who have used these myths, like the welfare queen and
Mhm.
the lazy poor. They have used these myths over and over again to score political points, particularly among conservative voters.
Yeah.
So that has happened. But I think also, I think this is another group that's kind of benefited, is that those who are doing well, if the myth is that, well, the poor just need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, then we really don't have to do anything structural.
Mm.
It's really your fault. I don't have any responsibility. On the
Right.
other hand, if we say poverty is a structural failing, then we do need to do have some policy to address that, and that may cost folks on the top a bit. As President Biden is talking about raising
Mhm.
taxes. So I think there are some groups that have benefited from the perpetuation of these myths, and those groups have also had the power to be able to shape that narrative. So it's a complicated question, but it's a really key one in terms of why the myths persist.
Okay, so I mean, what is the prescription then? I mean, we have, you know, this president is being compared to FDR in the breadth and scope of some of the initiatives he's now talking about and trying to gain some traction for in an era of practically zero bipartisanship on almost everything. Um, whether it's this infrastructure bill, the jobs part of that infrastructure bill, retraining. I mean, you heard someone like Albert uh, Wang talking about
Mhm.
this during the presidential campaign. You're going to have a 1.5 million truckers put out of work as self-driving trucks come into favor and replace them. I mean, so what are we doing? Are those people simply going to be permanently out of work, or will we take a look at that ahead of time and focus on there's so many different
Mhm.
things we are talking about, or some of us are talking
Mhm.
about, but it does feel like the other side, whether it's the business community or the politicians getting money from the business community, are really perpetuating these myths,
Mhm.
perhaps as you say, for their own
Mhm.
interests. So how do
Yeah.
we break through that?
Well, I do think, I'm actually guardedly optimistic that, as you pointed out with President Biden, I think we're in a window of time here where we actually could do some pretty positive things in terms of addressing inequality and poverty. So there's a lot of talk now about getting the minimum wage up to more of a livable wage, like $15 an hour, something along those lines. And, a number of years ago, that would have been unheard of. But today, it's actually, it's gained traction in many localities around the United States. But people are also talking about it on a federal level. So, that's one thing that's dealing with the structural problem of jobs not paying enough. There's also the idea of uh, uh, the uh, the earned income tax credit, it
Yeah.
slipped my mind, which is a way of also supplementing low wage workers. But here's another really, really interesting idea that Biden has proposed, and also Senator Romney, and it's this idea of a child allowance. Now, this is something that European countries have had for decades. The idea is if you have a child, we're going to provide you with a monthly amount of cash to help you raise that child. Well, President Biden is in the pandemic relief fund for a year, and it's $300 or $400, which would definitely help folks on the lower end of the income distribution. And interestingly, Mitt Romney proposed a similar idea, so that's pretty radical for the United States, and it's a subset of the universal basic income idea that Andrew Yang is talking about, where
Yeah.
you actually just provide, $10 or $12,000 a year for folks, just to help them, get by on. And it's an interesting idea. I think it's a hard sell in the United States because of because of the myths and the stereotypes that, oh, we're giving you money for nothing. But as we look into the future, and as you said, truck drivers and all kinds of places may see robotics and automation. We need to be thinking much more creatively. And what we need to do is we need to think about changing the structure and the rules of the game so that more people can have a decent life, as opposed to always focusing on who loses out at the game. So um so i i I think that there's some really interesting ideas out there, and again, I do think we are in a window of time where some progressive sorts of policies might be put in place.
Well, I did hear an interview on the news recently with, I believe it was Senator Young from Indiana, and he's not rushing to embrace the full scope of the
Hmm.
multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure bill, but there were certain parts of it that he was talking about, in terms of technology, investment in technology, um, and his focus was, this is going to bring good paying jobs to Indiana,
Yeah.
which 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 leads me to one of the other
Yeah.
myths that you address, which is the sense that poverty is predominantly an inner city
Mm,
problem, which is to say, a racial minority problem in this country, when in
yeah,
fact,
yeah,
white people,
yeah,
uh, the majority of people on welfare today are not people of color, they're white. Probably the majority of people in poverty are not
yes,
in the inner cities,
yeah,
are actually in rural communities. And the conservative, hold on the Senate is made up of
yeah,
senators from predominantly
yeah,
rural states. So
yeah. That's
maybe there's
interesting.
an opportunity there from a policy standpoint
Yeah,
if they could get past the rhetoric and the myth perpetration, to
yeah.
focusing on the people who actually are the voters in their states.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting way to go. I think that's a really good idea, and you're absolutely right that clearly, if you're non-white, you have a higher risk of poverty. But it turns out there are the largest group in poverty are whites. It turns out that today there's more poverty in suburbs than there are in central cities. And the deepest seated poverty in the United States is in rural America, Appalachia, the Deep South, the American Indian reservations, the central corridor of California, all of those areas have really, really high poverty. So, this is my point again that the reach of poverty is really wide. And folks in rural America would really benefit from these policies that we're talking about to reduce inequality and poverty. This is not just an inner city issue. This is an issue that cuts across America.
Well, as a sociologist, Mark, I'm curious about this too, because oftentimes it seems that the politics, which after all is what leads or doesn't lead to new policies, is is so constrained by language. So I mean, I gave the example of a progressive liberal or Democrat would look at inequality as a structural issue in the country to address. The resistance to that almost feels like resorting to name calling. Well, that's socialism, which is about language ultimately. uh I mean, is that something you look at? Because it seems like some of what we're talking about is reorienting how you think of the problem,
Hmm.
rethinking or maybe even renaming or redefining how you
Hmm.
think about some of the policy proposals to address poverty.
Yeah.
Uh, is that an approach that perhaps we should be focusing on more so?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, people attach labels and they sort of send up a red flag, when you say socialism or whatever. And sort of my take on this is, I'm not into that. I'm into sort of what the reality is. And, if the reality is that there's a structural problem, then there's a structural problem. And, I mean, I don't necessarily call that socialism. I call it, we need to deal with the system and the structural failings that are going on. So but you're right. People use this, these rhetoric and these labels to say, oh my god, we can't listen to this at all. And that's why I think, it's so important, particularly today. And you're in this field as well, that this whole idea of alternative facts, and you've
Mhm.
got your evidence, I've got mine. Well, that's not necessarily true. There's evidence, and then there's some
Yeah.
things that are wrong. and, and so like
I know.
my training is as a university academic researcher, and we're supposed to follow where the truth leads us. And that's what I've tried to do with this work, is to say, this is where the truth leads me. And now let me make my argument, let me lay out my evidence, and you can decide. But I think that's what we need to do.
Well, right, but again, if the answer or the false answer largely depends on the question, the way you frame that question. So if we say, let's defund the police, lots of people are going to say, what? We're not going to defund the police. And that leads to all kinds of political ads showing cities burning and people calling 911 and no one answering and that kind of thing. But if you talk about police are engaged in activities that even they don't want to be involved in because they're not qualified to deal with somebody who's having a mental health crisis or, police. All of a sudden now you're having a very different conversation that may lead to answers. And I know we're not talking about police reform, but I'm just giving that as an analogy where if we talk about welfare, it's become such a radioactive term. You're almost inviting those people who say, oh, well, I had to work for what I got, and you just want to redistribute income and raise my taxes. But if you talk about jobs and creating jobs, good paying jobs, all of a sudden it's a lot harder to be against that. I mean,
no, that's exactly
against creating good paying jobs in your community.
You're exactly right. And I would make a couple of points on this. One is that the idea, and President Biden has said this, and I completely agree. If you work full time in America, you shouldn't be poor. Now, most people, a lot of people are going to agree with that. That if you're working full time, if you're playing by the rules, you should do okay. I did a big book on the American dream, and this was one of the things that lots of people talked about. So I think, yes, how we frame the issue is clearly important. But here's the other thing that I wanted to bring up. What you're talking about, like with the police reform, you're presenting a more nuanced view. Too often in this country, it's black or white. It's like this or that, you're that or, and it's like a lot of these issues are much more gray and nuanced. Now, when you start talking about that, it's hard to have a sound bite, without, so it's more difficult, but that's really what we need to talk about, is that more nuanced view of these things.
Right. Well, that's why a podcast is a lot better than giving a one blurb answer to the cable news.
Yeah, there you go.
And why the book is obviously important too, because you need the ammunition. You need to understand the facts to go up against the person who's only read some blog put out by somebody in a basement somewhere, or by some of the people on Capitol Hill. You need actual facts at your disposal. So well, beyond what we've talked about, what do you think, Mark, is the thing that most people don't understand that they need to understand about poverty, and as a way to understanding, therefore, what we need to do about it?
Yeah, so I guess I would say, this is sort of your elevator kind of talk where you got 30 seconds for something. I would say, and I wrote another book earlier that had this in the title, but I would say that we need to understand that poverty is an issue that affects us all in one way or another. And I'll give you one other example of this. In the book, there's a study we did on the cost of childhood poverty, and I won't go into all the details, but basically what we showed is that childhood poverty, as a conservative estimate, is costing the United States slightly over $1 trillion a year. That was about 28% of the entire federal budget in 2015. And so the issue is not that we're paying or not paying, but we're paying on the back end of poverty. And that's always a lot more expensive than paying on the front end of poverty. And so, what we also show in that study is that for every dollar we spend reducing childhood poverty, we save $7 to $12 down the road. So the argument is that not only is confronting childhood poverty the morally right thing to do, but it's also economically the smart thing to do. And what we should be doing is investing in our human resources. That's really the best policy.
I think that's a very effective approach to arguing the issue. I mean, I think that was very effective during the Obamacare debates too. You've got all these uninsured people and lots of people. I remember Ross Perot in a debate was saying, "Yeah, sure, they come in the year, they have to leave. They don't have insurance. Too bad for them." And you're right. Morally, that's just that's just, how do you even swallow that? But if you think about the cost,
Mhm.
we're paying for the
Yeah.
uninsured, whether we
Yeah.
figure out how to
Exactly.
provide insurance or not. We're probably paying a lot more if we don't. And
Exactly.
I think that's a very effective way of thinking about so many issues, and how to think about this one too. Well, this is going to be something I know we're going to be paying a lot more attention to in the coming months. I hope, and I hope it gets
Yeah.
some traction, and uh, I hope he
Yeah.
continues to go big. We need it.
Yeah.
We need it. So thank you, Mark. This was great. I
Yeah.
really appreciate it so much. Mark Rank, social welfare professor at Washington U in St. Louis, and the co-author of the new book, Poorly Understood: What America Gets Wrong About Poverty, and my guest on the podcast today, which was a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks, Aaron. It was really great. Thanks.
Great to meet you.